As Ladislav said there towards the end of his comments, it obviously has been a difficult year, which has introduced new uncertainties, uncertainties that we knew from climate, but uncertainties that perhaps we were less prepared for in terms of the geopolitical challenges that we have faced since February of this year. To talk to us about what that means for food security, particularly in the context of the Common Agriculture Policy and the national strategic plans which are taking place, we will focus our next panel session on those questions. And to provide the context around that, I can think of no better individual to lead us off than Tassos Haniotis. He was, of course, more than 30 years in the European Commission. He knows more about agriculture policy and strategy than probably many of us will dare to learn in a lifetime collectively. And so to lead us off, Tassos, I hope you are with us. We are going to give you the floor for a short presentation, and then I shall invite my fellow panelists to join us. Tassos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm in The Hague for the Horizon project right now, so that's not what I cannot join you directly. To clarify one thing, I'm going to talk to you about food security and what is new in terms of the current context, and I leave to others actually to address the link of that to the strategic plan of the member states. As you can understand, having recently been in the Commission, I wouldn't like to comment on that right now. I see that you have my presentation there, so if we can next go to the next slide. I think what it is important to have in mind is that we're facing a market outlook as we have rarely seen it in the past. And what is very important to keep in mind here is that we have three interlinked areas where developments are extremely uncertain. The first one has to do with the outlook for agricultural and food markets. And I do not envy my former colleagues for having to prepare this year an outlook for where agricultural markets are going to go. Neither do I envy what the OECD had to do, because there are so many uncertainties about where prices are going to stabilize and when they're going to stabilize. Second, there is a significant uncertainty in the outlook for energy markets and also for the transition towards more sustainable means of energy. And third, and also extremely important, is the fact that we have emerging shifts in trade flows. So the outlook is also very uncertain. Now, if you take all three factors individually, every one of them in the current context points to an upward pressure on prices. Taken all three together, create a situation where this risk is significant, especially in the short-term and medium future. And also it has the potential to have very asymmetric impacts, both at the regional level, and may I add here, I forgot to put in the slide, also at the sectoral level. So the next slide here gives a sense of what it means in terms of agricultural and food prices. If we start with 2016, these are monthly nominal indices as they come from the World Bank. Whether you look in grains, which is the amber, whether you look in oils and meals in reds, or the food index in blue, that's the World Bank, a little bit different, but similar in direction with FAO, or in agriculture in green, what you have is a situation of a relative stability of a path with some volatility over the years up until 2020, and then a significant increase of all these prices up until last summer, and we do have a decline. But what is important to keep in mind is that if you compare the current level in the recent months, the last month, the World Bank is October that you have here, and you compare it with 2 years ago, we're still at about double the level of prices in nominal terms than where we were in the agricultural area. Next, the same thing is happening also in the energy markets. What you have here is, one thing that pops up immediately in this graph is what is happening with the natural gas in Europe, and enormous volatility and very high prices. Even today, with a collapse of the prices, we're talking about increases in the range of 8 times with respect to what we were used to have. It's interesting to look at fertilizer prices and also the natural gas price in the US. fertilizer producers in the US and in Europe use natural gas, but they're not, and they're sell in the same market, but the input cost that they have with a natural gas is extremely different. And you also see the crude oil. Now, if you put this in a longer term perspective, which is the next slide, please, you see that we have had a significant evolution of prices. This one is in real terms from the World Bank index going back to the 60s. You clearly see here two relatively recent periods where we have very significant spikes of prices. What you see in the overall trend of increasing prices, I have dotted the green line on the best fit that will come from this graph of what is the agricultural prices. For the very first time, we see some indications of some upward trend that you don't know whether it will prevail or not in the future. What you have here in red is energy, in green is agriculture, in blue, metals and minerals, which is essentially the business cycle, with a very significant influence of China and India in recent years. And with the dotted purple line is the fertilizer prices. Now, if you compare what happened 12 or 14 years ago and the current book on the next slide is trying to look into whether we're actually facing, next one please, a new situation, or we have seen that in the past. Now, very clearly, there are some significant similarities in the two price booms of 2008 and the present one. High prices, high volatility, and co-movement of all commodities are similar things in 2008 and 2021, 22. Energy costs were a big driver both times, and the pulled fertilizer prices at record levels. And we had similar security, food security concerns. Now, food security, you can do long definitions and long descriptions, but in essence, food security is something very simple that you feel in your stomach and in your pocket. The pocket one is the affordability issue, and the high food costs have a global impact, even in the developed world. Availability and when you feel in your stomach is mostly an issue right now for Africa, and it's a very significant and very important one. It was back in the previous boom, and it is right now. But there are some significant differences. Next, please, that we need to take into account. The first one is that the macroeconomic factors differ. We used to have a demand-driven debt crisis back in 2008. We have a supply chain bottleneck and inflation right now. I know that certain central banks have a different opinion, trying to solve a supply bottleneck by limiting demand right now with what is happening in interest rates. But the underlying macroeconomic factors are very different. And of course, we have something that we never expected would happen. The Russian invasion of Ukraine brought war in Europe and brought certain impacts that are completely different right now than what we have seen in the past. The second thing that is important to keep in mind is the natural gas prices play a very different role in these two booms. Back in 2008, natural gas prices were the lowest prices. They were pulling energy costs downwards because of the so-called shale gas revolution in the US at the time. What natural gas prices are doing right now is they're pulling all the other energy prices upwards because that's where the real crisis is, especially in Europe. And the other big difference is the level of grain stocks. Back in 2008, grain stocks were at record low levels because of successive low crops and weather events in certain parts of the world. What we have right now is a pretty comfortable level of stocks, but what we also have, especially in wheat, we have had a weather impact, but also the war has had an impact on some of these available stocks, especially in Ukraine, that are really blocked because of the war. And next, the most important thing to keep in mind right now in terms of the broader risks of agriculture is that we're dealing with factors that are exogenous to agriculture. You have all seen in the public debate what to do with policy, but what to do with policy with factors that are exactly outside of what farm policies, not only in the EU but globally, are meant to deal, is extremely difficult to find a solution. Now, what is also important to keep in mind is that there is, and Yanis also mentioned that before, is there is a strategic need to differentiate not only the natural gas sources, but other sources of where we import things in Europe. This will probably keep EU energy costs high in the immediate future, with significant implications in the agriculture and the overall economy. And what is also important to keep in mind is that the green transition affects energy, affects metals and minerals, and raises multiple geostrategic tensions because we also tend to import a very significant part of what we use even for sustainable sources of energy. This generates a global debate on security, and I think the best way, if you go into the next slide, is focus on what is par excellence the food security crop, which is wheat. And what you see, unfortunately, I don't see it that well in my graph here, is what has happened in the last 30 years. This is based on FAO data. On the left-hand side, I put all the traditional exporters. The EU and the US has lost some of their surplus, but they still have a surplus because mainly the US stopped producing as much wheat as they did in the past. The other traditional exporters, Argentina, Canada, Australia, slightly increased their surplus. Brazil is a smaller player here, and next to Argentina, they import all their additional needs of wheat. China and India became net exporters mainly because of the China changed position. But overall, if you look at all these players, they didn't really change much. Where the major difference has happened is the impressive gains of over 60 million metric tons in the surplus of wheat of Russia and Ukraine taken together, and the very dramatic increase in the deficit of the rest of Asia and Africa in the food deficit on wheat. That doesn't mean that directly Russia and Ukraine exported to this part of the world, but world markets are interlinked. So essentially what you have is the real impact of the war here, because by blocking all the role of Ukraine and a significant part of Ukraine's production of last year, but the potential also of the next year at least, we do have an immediate impact that has generated a debate about the link of food security to other type of priorities like climate change, and whether actually there is a tension between these two or not. So if we go into the next slide and go straight on in comparing the trade-off between food security and emissions. So if you go to the upper right hand, what you see there is an area where we have a decrease in emissions and an improvement in the trade balance. And both Ukraine and Russia, which significantly reduced emissions also because they had an enormous use of chemical inputs in the past, but also the EU have managed to actually move in the positive direction in both areas. It's another story whether the direction and the reduction of emissions is what we need to do. Clearly, in the EU, we need to do much more. But this is what happened in this particular area. Africa and China increased their deficit and reduced, increased emissions or worsened the trade balance. This is all cereals and not only wheat. That's why you have China where it is. Of course, Africa's increase in emissions comes from a very low level. It's not comparable uh, to the rest of the world in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, it's minimal. And what you have on the upper left side is the US and especially Brazil and India that improve their trade balance, but at the expense of emission. If you go to the next slide, you see the same situation when it comes to meats. And here what you have is only the EU is on the right side in decreasing emissions and improving the trade balance. And you have the stories that you expect, Brazil and the US increasing the trade balance significantly, India to some part, at the expense of emissions, and Asia, China, that would be the rest of Asia, there, China, in Africa on the bottom left side. This discussion indicates, these graphs indicate the tensions that exist in this debate, the public tension, this debate between food security and climate uh, action. But in my view, and I will try to pull that in the next slide, this introduces what I like to call three false dilemmas. The first one, and next one, please, is a false dilemma between food security and climate action. Now, food security is a global problem. There is no such thing. In Europe, we don't have a food security problem. Because if you have a food security problem in one part of the world, the whole world is going to feel it. We don't have a deficit problem, if you want, but we do have to address food security at the global level. The same thing applies for climate change. There is no such thing. We've done well with our emissions, we reduce them, so we don't have a problem at world level. Everybody has to move in the same direction. And we have to recognize that there are significant trade-offs in the actions we have to do. But more importantly, there are major synergies that remain unreported, despite the fact that we do have concrete cases that demonstrate that we can improve the situation both on food security and in climate action. The second false dilemma is this debate, next one please, between the private versus the public good. Now, let's be clear, the environmental problems are a textbook definition of what is a failure of private markets to accurately reflect the cost of environmental damage, but also a failure of public policies to address these issues. Otherwise, we wouldn't be debating about what we have to do more to address environmental issues. But the full chain bottlenecks are also demonstrating that we do have anti-competitive and non-transparent market behaviors if you only look at the manner by which we don't have a serious price transmission between the producer prices and the consumer prices, especially when prices tend to fall at the producer level and they don't make any equivalent adjustment at the consumer level. So the real bet, if you want, that you have in the public policy debate, and we have had this debate at least since 2008, I remember this OECD study in the jointness in the delivery of the economic and environmental efficiencies, we have to find ways where we can put together these two dimensions, the economic and the environmental, which also helps in the third dimension of sustainability, the social one. And finally, the third false dilemma that I see is the local versus the global solutions. Next, please. Uh, I mean, yeah. We have seen, especially in the COVID crisis, how local solutions do help enormously in bringing together, in a better way, producers or consumers and reflecting and matching, if you want, similar type of orientation in terms of what citizens want and in what producers that are ready to do things in a more sustainable way are ready to offer. And we should also expect that with all the geostrategic tensions we're going to face, this will become even more necessary in the future than what we have seen right now. Nonetheless, we should not have the illusion that by themselves, local solutions are enough to address global problems. They're necessary and in many cases extremely important, but they're not sufficient in certain areas, including in areas that relate to food security and climate action. So that is what I had to say up to now. Um, I hope I didn't raise too many questions because I'm from a distance to be able to answer them, but I'll stay around with you for the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tassos. I know you are going to stick around for the panel, which is great, and I do want to move us on in the interest of time. But just very quickly, one of your slides there on the emissions trade-off suggests that perhaps, whilst not perfect, the EU is beginning to manage these trade-offs better than other countries or areas of the world. Is that right? And why do you think that is?
It is right, but it's also right to say that in recent years, we have had a slowdown in this progress. although if you take into account the increase in the output per unit, we still are doing well. This is part of previous reform, especially a very significant impact is coming from the AGRI reform and subsequent reduction in internal support prices that reduced significantly chemical input use and made it much more efficient in the European Union. It's also the result of the transition of Central and Eastern Europe from the previous system into the integration of the European Union, and especially you had very significant decline on some also of the chemical input uses. But it might also be the result of what is an underestimated real improvement in best practices in the European Union. With my previous colleagues, we have had examples, and the Joint Research Center has done an excellent work of demonstrating how in certain areas we have had real progress. But that being said, we need also to be very clear that we need to do much more in the future than what we have done. But what is extremely necessary, and I find it a little bit frustrating, that we don't bring into the forefront the benefits we have had in certain practices, because at the end of the day, farmers are not going to listen to what bureaucrats and politicians, with all due respect, are telling them. They will listen and look at what their neighbors are doing, and if they do things in a better way, they will be ready to jump and use this opportunity.
Quite right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Tassos, for that. And of course, that question of whether or not it is a false dilemma to have food security and environmental security is the theme of our first panel.